So we have a very special guest today, everyone. We have Rabbi Pinchas, which is how Americans call me, Rabbi Pinchas, but his last name is Pinchas, Rabbi Yitzchak Pinchas. And he wrote a wonderful, wonderful new book called Kosher Astrology. It's one of the few books, I was telling him, it's one of the few books that I ordered on pre-order, which is very rare for me. But I was very intrigued and excited when I saw that it was a 500-page book coming out on astrology. Rabbi Pinchas and I share a common interest in astrology, as many of our viewers do as well. I wrote a book, The Jewish Guide to the Mysterious, which goes through many of the paranormal sorts of things, the Jewish approach to it. And so since you wrote an entire book on astrology, I want to delve into that a little bit. And I'd like to first start with this notion. Most people, when you think of astrology, you think of something that is entirely forbidden, totally hands-off, something that we should have nothing to do with as Bible-believing, Torah-believing Jews. So first, maybe can you open up with why are we even delving in astrology? Isn't this something that is forbidden to us?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. I loved your book as well. So yes, the topic of astrology is a very big topic, and it's one of the most confusing ones. The reason why I really wanted to write the book, because there's so much confusion. Because on the surface, it appears that astrology is forbidden, that the Bible speaks strongly against astrology. It's divination. And so that seems like, for sure, what are we doing? What's even the question? Why are we even talking about it? The thing is, as I delved into it, you discover there's a couple of different forms of astrology. And so what happened was, in the ancient times, in times of Abraham, what they used to do is they used to worship planets. They treated the planets as false gods. So it's literally idol worship. And then there was another component. What they did is also they used sorcery. So it's called astral magic. When the Bible forbids astrology and divination, it's talking about astral magic. And what did they do? They would take all kinds of spells and take blood from animals and hair from animals at certain astrological times in order to serve the false gods of the planets. And they believed that the planets would then help them or harm their enemies. So that was a form of idol worship combined with sorcery. And that's what the Bible was so fervently against, and speaks against divination and against astrology. It was talking about astral magic because it was idol worship. So that was one form of astrology that's strictly forbidden. There's another form that's called astromancy. And that's where they would make these fatalistic predictions. They believed if you were born with the energy of Mars, which is a bloodthirsty energy, that you're destined to be a bandit that murders people. They really believed that you didn't have choice, that if you were born with a certain astrological aspect, that you were forced to do something. Or they made predictions that when you're 45, your children are going to die. These are fatalistic predictions. And that's another thing. That's divination. That's not allowed. That's not. So the Bible is teaching us that those two forms of astrology, astromancy, idol worship with sorcery, and that's astral magic, and astromancy, the fatalistic version that predicts something specific, those two are forbidden. Then we can talk about what is allowed, what is kosher astrology, what that is. But that's the core of what the Bible is against.
Okay, and that seems to make sense. And a lot of people are unaware about the various types of astrology. That they use the term astrology, people automatically think of newspaper horoscopes, and obviously that's something that's not only silly but forbidden. But what we're saying over here, it seems, is that there is an aspect of astrology that it doesn't limit your free will, that's not trying to predict the future, that is something that we can at least make reference to in order to understand ourselves and our situation. And maybe you can elaborate on what that looks like. What does kosher astrology actually look like?
Okay, so it's a big topic and it's a complex process. So let's see if we can go through it. So really it starts, there's something called a birth chart, the moment that you're born. So what happens? We have a solar system, right? And we have all these planets, the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and they're constantly circling, they're orbiting the sun, right? And they're making these constant movements. And the moment you're born, It's like we take a snapshot, freeze all the planets exactly where they are in space, and that incredible amounts of energy that's there from all these planets is implanted within you. It's kind of like an apple seed. An apple seed has the potential, it's a tiny little seed, and has the potential to grow into a massive 150-foot tree, which produces apples, right? So it's a very powerful potential. So it's really important to understand that every moment of time has an incredible amounts of energy, and it's not gone forever, because that moment of time is implanted within a human being, and then that human being is meant to bring forward the energy of that moment for the next 60, 70, 80 years of their life. So it's an incredible picture. And the key is to understand that this is all coming from God. God is the one who created this and tasked each person with a unique gift and struggles in their life for them to bring it forward in their life. So that's the birth chart. It's the moment that you were born. It's a snapshot of the solar system, of all the energy that's brought into you. Now, in a birth chart, you can see the different planets represent different parts of you. One part represents, the moon represents your emotions, your feelings. Mercury represents your communication and thinking. So each part has a unique zodiac sign attached to it, but it also has other planets attached to it. So you can see your personality, your very unique personality, your gifts, your struggles, the parts of you that are in conflict. It really gives you incredible amounts of information telling you of who you are and what your gifts are. And even in your struggles, that there are tremendous gifts within your struggles. So there's a lot of information that's there. And then we start taking it apart. So it doesn't predict your life. It doesn't remove your free will, but it shows you your strengths. It shows you your gifts. It shows you the area of your struggle, and that we can really do something about. And that's what you're tasked with. That's your free will to really hone your gifts and bring it forward to the world.
Wonderful. And I love the way that you explained that so clearly, and that it really is sort of a map of your life, not sort of containing you into that this is the type of person you're going to be, but these are sort of like proclivities that you have. Maybe similar to if a person took a Myers-Briggs test or an Enneagram to get like more information about themselves. Your birth chart might be something as well that would help bring some reference to your challenges, your fortes, your talents, and everything in between. One thing that I wanted to ask you about while I was reading your book. So I mentioned to you that I finished your book cover to cover in one Shabbos sitting. I was actually on a speaking engagement, and I had the whole Shabbos afternoon to myself because the speaking engagement was done and everyone had gone home. And so I just trucked through it. I spent the whole Shabbos afternoon going through it cover to cover. And I enjoyed every minute of it. One question I had about, you had mentioned that when you're born, there are the whole planetary configuration and constellations and whatnot. The planets, the external planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Pluto's not even a planet anymore, but whatever. The sages, we don't really find, and you do mention this in the book. We don't really find any references to those planets because they were only discovered later. So my question is, as an observant Jew that is following astrology of the sages and the guidance of the sages, how are we to relate to the nuances that are brought out in these exoplanets, or not exoplanets, but these very distant planets that weren't discovered till later? They wouldn't really have a source in traditional Judaism.
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. And I devoted 2 chapters in my book to that question because it's such a powerful question, right? So here's what's really amazing. God directs the world, God directs history. And so what happened? So the world knew about 7 planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn for most of history until 1781. Now, what happened? That's when Uranus was discovered. What was going on at that time? That's when we had the Declaration of the Independence. That's when the United States was formed. It was middle of the Battle of the United States, 1776. And Uranus represents the energy of independence, authenticity. I need to be true to myself. It's about freedom. It's about rebellion. It's about individual rights, which is absolutely, God brought it forth in the world with the United States. The United States literally represents that energy, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of these things. It was the death knell of the monarchy. Up until then, kings ruled the world, ruled countries, and you didn't have rights. The king was able to say whatever he wants, and you had to do it. United States came in during the energy of Uranus. So God waited until the world was ready for this, until him to reveal it to the world. And that's with Uranus. Uranus brought all kinds of innovations into the world. The Industrial Revolution changed mankind. All of these things changed the history of the world, which we're still living. And then you have like Neptune. Neptune was discovered in 1846. And Neptune is about elevation and transcendence and a oneness with humanity. It's a oneness with the collective. And the world became so connected during that time. That's when you had the railway mania, which is bringing people together. They built thousands of miles of roads at that time. You had one of the biggest innovations was the telegram was invented in 1844 at the time of Neptune's discovery. The telegram is the grandfather of the internet. That connected the world like nothing ever before. And that's the energy of Neptune. So God waited for the right time when the world was ready. It's all in God's plan to reveal these planets at these specific times in order for it to advance the world. And the same thing with Pluto. Pluto, it's all about depth and transformation. It was discovered in 1930, which was one of the darkest times in human history. We had the Great Depression, and which led fascists started coming into power in 1932. We split the atom then. Pluto is all about depth and transformation, death and rebirth. And some of those big struggles, like the Great Depression, helped us to build different laws, financial laws. We then became one of the most powerful and successful nations because we went through the Great Depression. And that's what Pluto does. And each person's life, when Pluto comes into your life, that's a time when you're supposed to transform from a caterpillar into a butterfly. There's incredible transformation, but sometimes it can be a difficult process, like a dark night of the soul. So the thing with all these newer planets that were discovered, they came at a time when God wanted the world to take the next step in its history. And so that it was meant to be exactly at those times. But it's all part of the same system that God created. It's all one.
I found your chapters on this really fascinating, sort of giving an outline of history. It's certainly the last few centuries, in relation to the planets that were discovered and the energy that was perhaps most present. My question is more like, how do we know how to interpret the energies associated with those planets if we don't have an inherited tradition? Like some of the other planets, we have an inherited tradition from, whether it's the Talmud or other classic sources. Since we don't really have like an in-depth, we wouldn't have at all like what the energy actually represents. Where does the stipulation that Uranus is, for example, independence, like where does that come from?
Okay, so every one of the other planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, right? So you're right, we have a long history of it, and it's brought throughout the sages. They bring exactly those energies. So the new planets, so the thing is, at the time, there was known 7 planets. Every known planet had an energy, had a purpose. The whole point was that nothing was made in vain. Everything that God created has purpose and is here to help us in some way. It says that every blade of grass, the Medrash brings that every blade of grass has an astrological energy urging it to grow. That's the process of how God directs the world. So when the new planets come in, they're no different. It's the same system. They're no different. And we can see from observation, we can literally see how these energies come into our lives. We can see what transformation it did in the world, and then we can see in our own lives. So for example, Uranus is about being authentic and being true to yourself. So I have a whole chapter. President Trump has triple Uranus in his chart.
Right, I remember. Yeah,
right.
I remember you put some prominent
people, and you see it with them. So what's Uranus is? Don't tell me what to do. I'm going to be authentic. Because most people, we believe certain things, but we're quiet. We're worried that people are going to, if we speak up, we'll be canceled. Or we speak up, people will be against us. So we keep our opinions to ourselves. But if you have Uranus very strong in your chart, You don't care what anybody thinks. You're going to be authentic. You're going to speak your truth. And we've never had a president who's ever done that like President Trump. And he has triple Uranus in his chart. So we can see it blatantly. We can see the energy of what your Uranus represents blatantly in a chart. Now, here's the thing. It's not just, so President Trump was born with it. So that's something he has his whole life. But everybody at about every 22 years, that energy will come into your life. And that's a time for you to become individuated. It's a time for you to speak your truth. So it's something that affects everybody at different points in our lives. So it's a very powerful energy.
Where does this idea of the 22 years, what do you mean when you say that every 22 years you have different energy that surfaces?
So Uranus takes 84 years to orbit around the sun, right? So in your birth chart, it hits the sun in your birth chart when you were born. Every 22 years, it hits it at a different angle. So an opposition, a square, that's how they connect with each other. So every 22 years, that's Uranus. You have Neptune is once in 40 years because it's also the speed that they move. So Uranus moves every 84 years. Neptune's like 248 years for it to make a orbit. I'm sorry, that's Pluto is that. So you have different years, so that's why it affects you at different times. So some energies, they come into your life once in a lifetime. You know, I'll give you an example. So Neptune is about elevation and transcendence and connecting with the collective. And it's about idealism. It's about dreams. And everybody has a once in a lifetime energy when Neptune connects with their sun in their chart, with their core self. And that's their opportunity to really be transcendent. So I looked through history at different people, and you know who had that once in a lifetime energy of Sun Neptune? Martin Luther King, when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, one of the most powerful speeches in history. And even the title, I Have a Dream, is a very Neptunian energy. And also think of how idealistic it is that I have a dream that one day my children won't be judged by the color of the skin, but rather by the content of their character. And that's such a Neptunian thing. And it is one of the most famous speeches in American history. And it was during his once in a lifetime Sun Neptune progression. That's when an astrological energy hit him that he got that inspired and he was able to connect with the collective. It's something you tap into. And everybody, every human being has this. At one point in your life, you're going to have this energy. And on some scale, in some way, it's a time for you to transcend, to connect with spirituality, to connect with something greater, a message that you have to bring to the world. You know, so it's a very, very powerful energy that everybody has, and it's all directed by God because we're here for a purpose. Everybody's here for a purpose, and astrology can show you that, and it can show you not only what your gifts are and what your purpose is, but which times in your life. Again, it's not going to tell you what's going to happen. It's just going to say at this time you're going to have an incredible inspirational energy. So I would say use that inspirational energy, do something amazing of what you're here to do at that time. It's really, really powerful. You can see it with many figures in history. Really powerful.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, one of the figures that you mentioned from your book, that his sort of crux, I guess, dream or you know, stepping to the next level was Joe Biden, President Biden in 2020. Like that was astrologically. That was like his prime, which is a very interesting thing to see, which is when he became president. So it's interesting because it is a map of a person's life, not trying to project and see what the future is going to bring, but see when certain instances in your life may be more prone, I guess we could call it, to certain achievements, to certain abilities. It's a very fascinating topic. I wanted to ask you also about let's call it the dichotomy between the Jewish months for sun signs, for example, the Jewish months and the non-Jewish months. So like when you look up what sign am I, there'll be you know, it's June 24th through July 18th or whatever it is. And sometimes, according to the Jewish calendar, the Jewish months, a person could be one sign, where from the non-Jewish calendar, they could be a different sign. My wife is an example of that. My wife is a Scorpio by non-Jewish dates, but she's a Sagittarius because she was born Rosh Chodesh Kislev, first of Kislev. So the question is, which sun sign do you ascribe to yourself, and why?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and it causes tremendous confusion. It's probably my most frequently asked question
Okay.
is that because it's so confusing, right? What am I? Am I in the Hebrew month? Am I in English month? So here's the thing with astrology. It doesn't work not according to the English date or the Hebrew date. What astrology focuses on, where were the moment that you were born, where were the planets in the sky? I don't care what you call that date. It's about where the planets were. So for your personal astrology, that's what matters. That's why in the English dates, you'll see, Scorpio, they go, or Libra, it's from September 21st. It also doesn't go from the beginning of the month to the end of the month. It doesn't work in accordance either with the Gregorian calendar or the Hebrew calendar. It's when you were born for your personal energy. Now, every month in the Hebrew calendar has an energy assigned to it. There's a general energy of that month. So that is assigned to it. But in terms of your personal planets and your personal thing, that has to do is where were the planets when you were born. So you have to look at the day you were born and what does your birth chart say? So that's the distinction between it. So you have to
Got it.
separate between the personal and the general energy of a month. There's two different aspects of it.
But wouldn't according to that, if we're going to talk about, let's say, the sun sign, which theoretically would be for those maybe unfamiliar, that would be if you were able to see the night sky when the sun was coming up in the morning during that month, it would be going through a certain constellation. Now, because of the precession of equinoxes, where the sun would rise 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago is different than it would be today. So if it's about where the sun would be arising nowadays, it's a different sign that would have been 2,000 or 4,000 years ago, because I believe it's every 2,000 years that it moves on to the next sign. Yes. So the question is, are any of these sun signs still good? If I say that I'm a Cancer, am I really still a Cancer, even though I'm born in Tammuz and I'm born in July? But am I still a Cancer? Would my sun sign be different because that's when I was born in this year? In the year I was born, it may have been going through a different sign. How does that work?
Absolutely. So, a few years ago, they came out in all the newspapers about the precession of the equinox, like it was news. Hey, astrology is all wrong. If you thought you were a Pisces, you're really an Aries because things have moved. Here's the thing. In astrology, we knew about this for the last 2,000 years. Ptolemy wrote books on astrology. He was like one of the main people who wrote main books on astrology. And he talks about the precession of the equinox 2,000 years ago. And since then, we've been using the tropical system. We don't go according to the physical space of where the planets are. We go according to the seasons. In the Bible talks about that Passover has to always be in the spring. So you see also the Bible uses the seasons as markers. And so in astrology, for the last 2,000 years, in Western astrology, we use the seasons as markers. So it has nothing to do with any movement in terms of the constellation. So if you were born a Pisces, you still are a Pisces. Yeah, it's not even a question about it. So it's really because it's a different system.
Right. I understand that, but going back to the question of, do we go by the Jewish month, or do we go by the sort of the secular way that astrology is? In other words, is my wife, is she a Scorpio or is she a Sagittarius?
Right.
Or
so
neither.
It's not attached to the Hebrew month. Your personal chart is not attached to the Hebrew month. In Judaism, we have something called, we go after the majority. So even if the whole month is not technically that energy, we combine it. We say the whole month is the energy of Pisces. That but we do it. Our calendar is very complicated. The Jewish calendar is very complicated. Even for the new moon, we also use an average. We don't use a specific. So it gets complicated. So really, we have to focus on every month. The Jewish Hebrew has an energy overall for the month, but individually, look at your chart. In your chart where you were born, that is the energy of your planet. But by the way, if you were born on the cusp, you have to remember, people think there's only one zodiac sign. No, your sun is in the zodiac sign. You also have a moon and a Mercury and a Venus, which represent different parts of you. So even though your sun might be in that sign, your emotions might be in the next sign. So you also might have the elements of the next sign. You have to see your chart to see which 4 or 5 different zodiac signs that you have and which ones are the most prominent. So that's also why people get confused about it. You really have to look at your birth chart.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a fair statement to say that somebody who has on the non-Jewish astrological one sign and on the Jewish another sign that the person is born on the cusp or has both energies. That's not necessarily a true statement.
Correct. Now they might have both energies because usually Mercury and Venus is very close to the sun. So usually if you're on the cusp, you're usually going to have a planet or two that's also in the next sign. So that's why you might relate to the other sign. But it's very clear. You can see what your sun sign is. There's no cusp. You're literally, if it's born at the 29th degree, that's the energy of that sign. So you can see it clearly with your birth chart.
Do we find in the biblical text itself, especially for our non-Jewish listeners, for our Jewish listeners, we have an entirety of tradition. We have the Talmud, we have Medrash, we have Zohar, we have a tremendous amount in Jewish literature that explains what's going on, obviously, in the Hebrew Bible. Do we find instances of this sort of kosher astrology in the actual Hebrew Bible text? Because it seems to me in the Hebrew Bible itself that there is a sort of there's a certain degree of accuracy attributed to it, but in a messed up sort of way. So when Pharaoh's seers see that the Redeemer of Israel is going to have his downfall through the water, that is true, but what that actually meant, it doesn't come out in a clear way in the text itself. Do we find instances in the Bible itself, in the text, where this sort of kosher astrology is done?
Yes, and it's so blatant, it's mind-blowing. Literally, in Genesis, in the 14th verse, in 1:14, Genesis 1:14, it talks about that God created the luminaries to separate between the day and the night. And then look at the next word. It says, V'haya la'osos. It should be for signs. Another reason
right.
of why God created the luminaries, they should be for signs. And all the commentaries, they all explain that it's talking about astrological signs. So it's straight out in the Bible in the 14th verse that God created the sun and the moon. They should be for astrological signs. And so first of all, that's like, wow, straight out in the Bible about it. Remember, it's talking about the kosher version, right? Now, the Egyptian astrologers, they were not using the kosher version. They were using astral magic and also astromancy, which is a fatalistic version. So they said, we see that the Jews have the planet Ra and they're going to die in the desert. We see blood in the desert. They were wrong. The Jews didn't die in the desert. They had circumcision in the desert, which was blood. So it's not, they try to predict the specific, and that you can't do. There's a general energy that's true with astrology. The kosher version talks about general energy, but you can't predict specifics. And whenever there is in the Bible that people try to predict specifics, the Bible shows them that they were wrong. So there's clearly delineating between kosher and not kosher astrology. But in the 14th verse, you have it straight out that that's part of the Bible.
Fair enough. No, that's great. So we're told in our tradition that Avram Avinu, Abraham, was a master astrologer, and leaders would come to hear his advice and his guidance. According to astrology, there's all sorts of stories where when Isaac is born, his interaction with God, saying that Jupiter is in the wrong place, I'm not going to have a son, and God says, I override that. Who's the one who created the stars to begin with? I'm the ultimate supervisor. So when it comes to astrology as a wisdom, so would it be fair to say that this is something that is already taught to or present in the time of, let's say, Adam and Eve, and as their descendants slowly devolved into idolatry, that the understanding of astrology devolved with it, and it got attributed to idolatrous forces, but that at its core, that this is something that's been present all the way from the beginning? When would you say, from a Judaic tradition, that astrology was taught, the wisdom of astrology was taught to humanity, or is it something we came up with on our own, like mathematics or other forms of science?
So Maimonides talks about that, and so there's different versions of it. Like, so there's one where it says that God taught Abraham, he taught him astrology. One of the gifts that he gave him, it says in Genesis that that God blessed Abraham with everything. And the Talmud explains what is everything? That was the gift of astrology. And Abraham used astrology to teach the world about God. He said these planets are not random and they're not false gods. There's only one God. But Maimonides starts and says that the tradition started earlier about astrology and it became corrupted. First they wanted to serve the planets because they knew the planets were messengers from God. So they figured, I have to show, just like a king, I show honor to the messenger of the king. So I want to show honor to the messenger of God, the planets. And they started like worshiping and serving the planets. And then it became mixed up and they actually started believing that the planets were gods themselves. That became very corrupted until the time of Abraham. And Abraham was the one who stood up and said, no, that's the wrong version of astrology. That's a falsehood. There is one God who directs astrology, and he corrected it. And he wrote the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, which is full of astrological meaning, deep astrological meaning, Kabbalistic meaning, and that's from Abraham. So that's how we started with astrology, and that's the father of the Jewish nation, put us on the right direction because we were going in the wrong direction in terms of astrology. So all the negative sources are talking about the astral magic, the idol worship and sorcery aspects of astrology, which Abraham came to say, no, that's false. There is a God, and God created astrology to help direct your life. God wants to be involved in your life. It shows you God's personal involvement in your life. It's such a powerful idea, not just who you're meant to be and your purpose, but also at different points in your life when you go through struggles, when you're here to achieve things. It's all part of God's plan and it's all laid out. You can see it in your astrological charts. It's amazing, really amazing.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. So it sounds like it would be at least fair to say that, contrary to how the secular world views things, the secular world not only believes in the concept of biological evolution, but also the evolution of thought and theology. So that from a secular vantage point, people used to believe in multiple gods, and over time they evolved into the concept of one God, where Jewish tradition flips that on its head and said, no, originally we believed in one God, Adam and Eve, and then slowly as the generations continued and people started spreading out and looking at things in a strange way, they devolved and started believing that these forces that God made, like the sun, the moon, and the stars, to be a sign or to have their own utility, that they were gods in and of themselves. And it sounds like astrology kind of followed suit, that this wisdom of astrology was God-centered, as the Torah says right from the beginning, that it was put there to derive the signs from. And then slowly over time, it devolved into the idolatrous associations that people were associating God with. So if somebody read your book and they wanted to then say, okay, I like what Rabbi Pinchas has to say. We'll have to be sure that I'm Rabbi. Well, I'll be Rabbi Taylor for now. You'll be Rabbi Pinchas. I like what he has to say. He gives a very thorough case. And again, I do endorse everybody to go check this out. It's a very unique book. They say, okay, I like what he has to say. He sold me on the idea. Well, what can I do next if I want to find out maybe about a bit more about my own life and my own path? Are there places where I could go to explore in a kosher way to explore more about my, like, I guess we could call it my life map?
Absolutely. So I would say you start with my book, because in my book, it's 500 pages and I have 75 pages of full color illustrations that really breaks down astrology, what the different planets mean, how it works, what the process is. And so it's done with illustrations, so it's really easy to understand. So I think you really first understand the core of it. Then the next step I would say is take a look at your birth chart. And there's many websites you can get, just take your birth chart and see where your planets are and see what they are. But really, you have to know more if you really want to go into depth. I also do chart readings. You can go to my website, kosherastro.com. But I'm a big believer. I want everybody to learn for themselves. At the beginning, it may sound complicated because there's a lot of moving parts and pieces. If you take it one step at a time, you really can learn for yourself. Everybody can be an astrologer, and you can follow along in your own life and see the process of life. It's so fascinating. It's so clear. You will see clearly there are cycles, and you can see the major events in your life are going to happen at certain cycles. It's new beginnings in your life that are happening and new things. It's so powerful. You can see, like, I'll give you an example, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, right? So nobody, he was a nobody. He was a member of Congress. Nobody expected him to be. He had a
Right.
Pluto transit. He had a once in 40 years. Pluto is about death and rebirth. It's about transforming you. It's about a caterpillar. If you tell a caterpillar that you can fly, the caterpillar says, "You're being ridiculous. I need 28 legs just to walk. I can't fly." We're stuck in our concepts. We're limited. But when this energy comes into our life, it opens us up, and we go through a process that we can turn into a butterfly and fly. And it's very empowering. So he became president. Speaker Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, he also was a one-term congressman. He wasn't anybody. He had Pluto, again, once in 40 years, and Pluto empowers you. He became the third most powerful person in the United States, the Speaker of the House. So you can literally see these different times in your life that are ripe for growth. Now, it's not going to guarantee you that you're going to win an election. So, for example, Nikki Haley also had Pluto in her life when she was the front runner in the primary running against Trump. So she didn't win, but still it transformed her. Now she's like a front runner. There's a transformational energy. It doesn't guarantee a result, but something in you is changing. Something in you is going through a major change. And you can see it. You can see it in public figures' lives, and you can see it in your own life. So it's so powerful.
It's so fascinating. Are there resources that you would either endorse or that you could point us to if somebody was interested in learning how to, in a kosher way, properly learn how to either construct their own birth chart or read a birth chart and kind of understand what the meanings are? Like your book is certainly very helpful in understanding what the planets are, the planetary system, and the different energies associated with it, and how we find it throughout history. And I mean, there's loads of information. But if a person wanted to start from square one and say, okay, I would like to learn how to, in a kosher way, learn how to make a birth chart, or at least read a birth chart, what would be either books, videos? Where would one go to learn that?
Right. So there are a lot of great books on astrology. There's no question about it. The problem is you're asking me to say that it's kosher. And the problem is it can be great books, but sometimes they mix in about the myths and about the things that are not so kosher. And so I can't endorse any particular book. If you're able to really, read a book and just throw out the kosher parts, then you can do that. But otherwise, so I can't endorse a particular book because, again, they're great books and has tremendous amounts of information, but sometimes they're mixed in with not so kosher things. So hopefully, as my book comes out, I'm hoping it opens the door for more and more people to write specifically kosher-oriented astrology books. There are many rabbis who are also into astrology and been practicing astrology, but they kind of keep it quiet because there's this stigma that astrology is forbidden. It's against the Bible, right? And so I wanted with my book to open the door, remove the stigma, and show clearly this is a God-centered tool. This is revealing the heavenly glory. By studying astrology, many of our sages talk about that. It's revealing the heavenly glory of God. You're appreciating who God is, that he's deeply involved in your life. So coming from that point of view, I welcome people to write books and create courses. And I think the time is ripe for it. And I think you're going to see that in the next few years.
Well, let's hope so, because as you mentioned, the real glory of what astrology is supposed to do is that you see sort of the fingerprint that God has made left in creation, and to see the map that's really just embedded in the reality as we know it. I'd really love to thank you for coming and joining us today, having this really fascinating discussion. We could, I mean, for myself, and I'm sure for our viewers as well, we could go on for hours just going back and forth and talking about different angles. But in the meanwhile, until we can do that again, I'd recommend everyone to go check out Kosher Astrology. You're not going to be disappointed. There's tons of information in here, all sourced in our tradition. And it was really a pleasure having you out here today. So thanks so much, Rabbi Pinchas, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast. Thank you so much.